Arthur and Lillian Brooks had built their entire life around one belief that hard work, love, and sacrifice would someday be enough. For 53 years, they had done everything right. Arthur worked as a carpenter, Lillian as a nurse. They raised 3 children, paid their bills on time, and finally paid off their modest 2-story home on Birch Avenue. That house wasn't just walls and wood. It held every photo, every Christmas morning, every scraped knee they had ever kissed better. Then one Tuesday morning the doorbell rang. Their eldest son, Brian, stood outside, unable to meet their eyes. In his trembling hands was an envelope, an eviction notice signed by him. "It's just business, Dad," he said, his voice flat, as if repeating a line he didn't want to believe. Property values were high, and he'd decided to sell. He said they'd be better off in assisted living. To Arthur, those words hit harder than any storm he had ever weathered. They had no savings left after medical bills. Their Social Security barely covered groceries. Within a week, their life was reduced to what could fit in the back of Arthur's rusty Ford pickup. He loaded a few tools, an old photo album, Lillian's wedding ring box, and Daisy, their 10-year-old golden retriever, whose gray fur now matched Arthur's beard. They drove, without a plan, just away from the house that was no longer theirs, away from the betrayal that made them question everything they'd lived for. Nights were spent sleeping in the truck cab, Daisy curled between them for warmth, the dashboard light flickering over their tired faces. When you've worked your whole life, believing your children will look out for you, and then one day they decide you're too much trouble, something inside you breaks. Lillian cried quietly, not for the house, but for the way Brian had looked through her like she was a stranger. Arthur stayed silent. He didn't know how to fix this. This wasn't a broken roof or a leaking pipe. This was the kind of crack no hammer could mend. Still somewhere between the empty highways and the late-night truck stops, Arthur held on to a thought that refused to die. Maybe they weren't finished yet. Maybe losing everything was the world's cruel way of asking them to start over. 3 days after leaving everything behind, Arthur and Lillian were still driving with no destination, just chasing the next sunrise. The road stretched endlessly through small towns and silent fields, the kind of places where time didn't rush anyone. They passed shuttered diners, broken gas pumps, and motels that looked like they'd given up years ago. When the last of their coffee turned cold, Arthur pulled the truck over. The map said they were near a place called Maple Creek, a name that sounded kinder than it looked. On the edge of town, past a gravel road lined with weeds taller than the mailbox, they saw it, a shack half swallowed by nature. The roof sagged like tired shoulders. The windows were nothing but holes, and the door leaned crooked on rusted hinges. It didn't look like shelter. It looked like the kind of place people forgot existed. Lillian sighed. "It's falling apart." Arthur didn't answer. He got out of the truck and stood still, scanning the frame like a craftsman reading a story written in wood. Years of carpentry had trained his eyes to see what others missed. Beneath the rot, he saw bones that were still strong. The foundation was old stone solid. The beams, though weathered, hadn't given up yet. And something in him, the part that refused to be beaten, stirred again. Daisy jumped from the truck and began circling the shack, tail wagging, nose to the ground. She sniffed every corner, pausing at what might once have been a front door, as if saying, "This is it." For the first time in days, Arthur smiled. Maybe the dog knew something they didn't. He called out, "Lillian, come look at this." She hesitated, then stepped closer, clutching her jacket against the wind. Up close, the place looked worse, vines crawling up the sides, holes in the roof big enough to see daylight through. But Arthur's gaze wasn't on the decay. He was picturing a new roof, a working door, maybe even smoke curling from a chimney again. "It's got potential," he said quietly. "More than most people would think." Lillian looked around uncertain. "You want to live here? I want to try," Arthur replied. "It's not much, but nobody else wants it, and that means nobody will take it from us." Those words hung in the air like a fragile promise. After months of feeling unwanted, they had found a place that was too broken for anyone else to claim, and that made it theirs. They spent that night parked nearby, sleeping in the truck with the sound of crickets outside and a thin moonlight washing over the shack. For the first time in weeks, the darkness didn't feel so heavy. There was a sense of direction again, small but real. Sometimes starting over doesn't begin with a plan. It begins with ruins, with the decision to stop running and rebuild something the world forgot. Arthur looked at the broken roof and saw a second chance. Lillian looked at him and saw the same thing. And in that quiet moment by the side of a forgotten road, the Brooks family, 2 worn-out souls and 1 loyal dog, found the first hint of home again. The morning after they found the shack, the air smelled like damp earth and wood dust. Arthur stood in front of the crooked doorway, sleeves rolled up, eyes scanning every splintered board like a man greeting an old friend. It wasn't much, but it was standing, and that was enough to start. He picked up his hammer, the same one he'd carried for decades on job sites, and began removing the rotten shingles from the roof. Each nail he pried loose echoed through the quiet valley. Lillian, meanwhile, swept the floor inside, pushing years of dirt and leaves into neat piles. Her hands, once used to holding IV lines and blood pressure cuffs, now gripped a broom with the same quiet steadiness. She hummed under her breath, maybe out of habit, maybe to keep herself from thinking about what they'd lost. By noon, Arthur had patched the worst leaks with scavenged boards from the truck bed. Lillian had cleared a small corner just big enough for Daisy's blanket and a couple of canned goods. When Arthur stepped inside, covered in dust and sweat, she handed him a tin mug of coffee boiled over a camp stove. It wasn't much, but it tasted like home. They didn't have electricity or running water, and the roof still sagged in places. But when the rain came that afternoon, only a few drops made it through. Lillian looked up smiling for the first time in weeks. "It's holding," she said. Arthur just nodded, watching the water slide down the repaired planks. For the first time in a long while, he felt useful again. Needed. That night they sat together by the flickering light of a lantern, Daisy curled between them, her head resting on Arthur's boot. Outside, the crickets played their endless song, and for a brief moment, the world didn't feel cruel. It felt quiet. It felt earned. Sometimes life doesn't give you a clean slate. It gives you a pile of scraps and asks what you can build from them. Arthur had spent his whole life fixing other people's homes. Now he was fixing his own heart, 1 nail at a time. And Lillian, who had spent years mending bodies, was now tending to something just as fragile, their faith in tomorrow. They didn't talk much that night. They didn't need to. The sound of the wind brushing through the trees, the creak of the newly fixed roof, and Daisy's steady breathing filled the silence better than words ever could. It wasn't comfort in the old sense of the word, no warm bed, no steady paycheck, but it was something deeper, a fragile peace held together by willpower and love. When the lantern finally dimmed, Lillian leaned her head on Arthur's shoulder. He took her hand, rough and cold, but alive. For the first time since they'd lost everything, they weren't just surviving. They were beginning again. And though the world outside still looked broken inside that little shack, something had finally started to heal. A few days after they started fixing the shack, Lillian decided to clean the last untouched corner, a small space by the back wall where the boards creaked louder than anywhere else. The morning light came through a crack in the roof, slicing through the dust like a soft blade. She knelt down with a rag and began wiping the floor, but something caught her attention, a hollow sound beneath the wood, faint but distinct. Curiosity replaced exhaustion. She pressed her palm against the floorboards, tapping gently until she found the loose one. With the back of a hammer, she pried it open. Beneath the dirt and cobwebs lay a small wooden box, worn smooth by time and covered with a thin layer of dust. The clasp had long rusted shut, but when she tugged it free, the lid gave way with a soft sigh, as if exhaling the weight of forgotten years. Inside were photographs, faded but full of life, a young couple standing in front of the same shack, smiling with pride. On the back of one photo, written in a careful hand, were the words, "Thomas and Evelyn Harper, 1964, our first home." Lillian sat there for a long moment, the box resting on her knees, her breath uneven. She called out to Arthur, who came in wiping his hands on a rag. When he saw what she'd found, he crouched beside her silently. They looked through the photos together, a wedding day, a small garden, a man painting the same door Arthur had just repaired. Then there were letters, bundled with a thin ribbon. Words of love, plans for the future, sketches of a porch that was never built. It felt less like discovery and more like meeting kindred spirits. Two lives separated by time, yet bound by the same dream to build something out of nothing, to make a home out of the ruins, life left behind. Arthur traced the name Thomas Harper with his finger and smiled faintly. "Looks like he was a builder too," he said. Lillian nodded, and she wrote like she believed in him. That afternoon they placed the box on the small table near the window where the light hit it just right. It wasn't just an old keepsake. It was a reminder that the house had a heartbeat long before they arrived, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't done beating yet. The shack no longer felt abandoned. It felt shared, like it had seen this story play out before, two people arriving broken and leaving whole. The letters of Thomas and Evelyn became quiet teachers, whispering that love and hope were still possible even after loss. Later that night, as Arthur worked on the roof by lantern light, he glanced at the window and saw Lillian reading one of the old letters aloud to Daisy, her voice soft and full of wonder. In that moment, it didn't feel like they were living in someone else's home. It felt like they were continuing a story that had never truly ended. Sometimes life gives you signs in the simplest ways: a box under the floor, a name on a photo, a feeling that someone before you once fought the same battles and refused to give up. Arthur and Lillian didn't just find a box that day. They found belonging. And from that moment on, the house didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like it had chosen them. The first week in Maple Creek tested them more than any storm could. News of the elderly couple living in the old Harper shack spread fast. In small towns, curiosity travels quicker than kindness. Some people slowed their cars just to stare. Others whispered outside the grocery store, calling them the crazy folks who moved into the ghost house. It didn't matter that Arthur and Lillian had nowhere else to go. To the townspeople, they were strangers who didn't belong. Arthur heard the whispers but kept working. Every morning he climbed up to the roof with his hammer and a quiet purpose. He fixed what he could and learned to ignore what he couldn't. His hands, rough and blistered, moved with the rhythm of a man who'd spent his life proving worth through work. It was his language, one nail, one board at a time. Lillian, too, carried on. She cleaned, planted small flowers in cans by the window, and cooked simple meals that filled the house with the scent of something warm and familiar. People love to talk until they see results. Within a week, the shack began to change. The roof no longer sagged. The front step no longer crumbled under weight. A soft yellow light now glowed from the window each night, and even the mailman began leaving small nods of respect when he passed. Still, not everyone was kind. One afternoon at the general store, Lillian overheard two women whispering that those folks are too old to be fixing anything. She smiled politely, bought her coffee, and went back to the shack without a word. On the walk home, she thought about all the times people underestimate the elderly, how society often forgets that age doesn't erase skill or spirit. It only deepens them. That night, Arthur finished mending the door and stood back to admire it. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. "Looks solid," Lillian said. He nodded. "So are we." In that small exchange, something shifted. The house was no longer just a shelter. It had become a mirror, reflecting who they were, scarred, but standing fragile, yet unbroken. They weren't rebuilding just walls. They were rebuilding faith in themselves. Every blister, every ache, every nail driven into stubborn wood felt like a step toward reclaiming their dignity. Work became therapy. The sound of the hammer replaced the sound of regret. Lillian's quiet humming returned. Daisy would lie on the porch, tail thumping whenever a breeze carried the scent of fresh paint. By the end of that month, even the neighbors began to soften. A man dropped off old lumber one morning, pretending it was extra. A woman left a basket of muffins on the porch. People started waving instead of whispering. Maple Creek was slowly remembering that decency grows where effort is seen. Arthur and Lillian didn't set out to change anyone's mind. They just wanted to live. But through their persistence, they reminded an entire town of something simple: hard work still commands respect. Sometimes dignity doesn't come from comfort, it comes from creation. And as the sun set behind the rebuilt roof, the couple sat side by side watching Daisy chase fireflies across the yard. The house creaked softly, no longer a ruin, but a promise kept. They were no longer outsiders. They were home. One gray afternoon, as a cool wind swept through Maple Creek, Lillian heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. She opened the door to see an older woman standing there holding a steaming bowl of soup, wrapped carefully in a towel. Her hair was white and neatly pinned, her eyes kind but curious. "I thought you two might need something warm," the woman said with a smile. Her name was Rose Mitchell. She lived 3 houses down, though 3 houses in Maple Creek meant nearly half a mile. It was the first time anyone had come by without a question or a judgment. The soup smelled like comfort potatoes, carrots, maybe a bit of thyme. Lillian thanked her, feeling awkward and grateful at once. Rose didn't stay long that first day. She just handed over the bowl, nodded toward Daisy on the porch, and said, "My sister used to love dogs like that." Then she turned and started down the path, leaving behind a warmth that had nothing to do with the soup. Later, when Arthur returned from chopping wood, Lillian told him about the visit. Something in her tone made him pause. "Did she say her last name was Mitchell?" he asked. Lillian nodded. Arthur thought for a moment, then reached for the wooden box they had found under the floorboards. Inside, on one of the faded envelopes, was a return address, E. Harper Care of Rose Mitchell. That night, when Rose returned with fresh bread, the connection was clear. She was Evelyn Harper's younger sister, the same Evelyn who once lived, loved, and dreamed inside this house decades ago. The realization felt strange, almost sacred. The line between past and present blurred. As they talked, Rose shared stories about the Harpers. Thomas had built most of the house by hand. The carved walking stick that still leaned near the door, his. He'd etched initials along the handle, each one marking a memory: the day they finished the roof, the birth of their first child, the spring they planted the lilacs out front. When Arthur held that walking stick later that evening, it fit perfectly in his hand, as though waiting for him all along. It wasn't just wood. It was legacy proof that work done with love outlives the hands that made it. For the first time, Arthur and Lillian didn't feel like intruders fixing up a stranger's house. They felt chosen, as if the place itself had invited them to continue the story. Rose began visiting often, bringing small things, jars of jam, old nails from her shed, and stories that filled the silence of the nights. Each visit added another layer of connection, stitching the broken edges of their lives back together. Belonging isn't always about where you're from. Sometimes it's about who shows up with a bowl of soup when the world has forgotten you. Rose reminded them of that truth. Her kindness bridged the gap between what was lost and what could still be found. By the end of that week, the house no longer felt like a refuge from the world. It felt like part of one alive again, with voices, memories, and the smell of soup lingering in the air. For Arthur and Lillian, it was the first real taste of home. It began with a low rumble in the distance, the kind of thunder that sounds like a warning. The sky over Maple Creek turned a heavy gray, and the air thickened with the smell of rain. Arthur stood on the porch, watching the clouds gather like an army. It had been 2 weeks since he finished patching the roof, and this storm would be the first real test. Inside, Lillian moved a few pots and blankets away from the walls just in case. Daisy paced the floor, sensing the change in the air. They had lived through many storms before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about weather. It was about proof that what they built with their bare hands could stand against something bigger than themselves. When the rain finally came, it came hard. Sheets of water slammed against the windows, and the trees bent in the wind like they were bowing to something fierce. The shack groaned and creaked, every nail holding its breath. Arthur grabbed a lantern and climbed up to the attic, eyes tracing every corner of the patched roof. He half expected to see a stream of water pour through the seams, but nothing came. Only the steady drumming of rain above, loud, relentless, but sealed out. Downstairs, Lillian sat on the floor, her back against the wall, hands wrapped around Daisy's collar. She looked up when Arthur appeared at the top of the stairs, soaked and smiling. "It's holding," he said simply. For a second, she thought she misheard. Then she looked up and realized not a single drop had fallen through. Something inside her broke open. She covered her mouth with her hands and began to cry, not from sadness, but from relief so pure it hurt. Arthur sank beside her, his shoulders trembling, and for the first time in months they both laughed, the kind of laughter that comes only after too much loss. Daisy barked, spinning in circles, tail thumping against the floor. The storm raged on outside, but inside the air was calm, safe. The old shack that had once seemed beyond saving was now protecting them, as if grateful to be alive again. It wasn't perfect. There were still cracks in the walls, drafts in the corners, but that night it felt like a fortress. When dawn came, the rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Sunlight spilled through the window, painting golden lines across the floorboards. Arthur stepped outside, mud clinging to his boots, and looked up at the roof glistening under the light. It stood tall, solid, defiant. Lillian joined him on the porch, handing him a cup of coffee. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of gratitude, of victory, of something quietly sacred. Sometimes it takes a storm to show you what's strong enough to last. That night didn't just test the roof. It tested their faith, their patience, their will to believe that good things could still hold, and for the first time in a long while, they passed. The shack had survived, but so had they. And from that morning on, Arthur and Lillian didn't just live in the house. They lived with it, weathered, imperfect, but strong, where it mattered most. Over the next few months, Maple Creek slowly began to change, not through grand speeches or announcements, but through quiet acts of kindness that started at the old shack on the hill. What began as survival for Arthur and Lillian became something larger, something that reached beyond their front porch. Arthur started fixing things around town. At first it was small, a broken chair left by a neighbor's gate, a fence that needed mending, a squeaky door at the post office. He didn't ask for payment. He just showed up, toolbox in hand, doing what he'd always done best. It was his way of saying thank you to a town that, despite its hesitation, had given him a second chance. Lillian, meanwhile, found her own rhythm. Her nursing instincts never left her. When Mrs. Jensen down the road fell ill, Lillian walked over with soup and stayed through the night. When a boy scraped his knee near the store, she cleaned and bandaged it with the same care she once gave her patients. Word spread quickly. The woman in the Harper shack had healing hands and a warm heart. Before long, people stopped whispering and started visiting. Some came for help, others just for company. The couple, who were once those old folks fixing a dead house, had become part of the town's pulse again. Children left drawings for Daisy, who now spent her afternoons lying on the porch, wagging her tail at every visitor. She'd become a local celebrity, Maple Creek's four-legged ambassador of goodwill. It was a quiet transformation. One favor turned into another. Someone dropped off extra firewood. A teenager volunteered to paint the fence. The grocer started setting aside bruised fruit for Daisy. And on Sunday afternoons, Rose Mitchell often joined them for tea, her laughter blending with Lillian's as Arthur whittled small trinkets for the neighborhood kids. The town didn't just see two elderly outsiders anymore. They saw what resilience looked like. They saw that dignity doesn't fade with age. It deepens through endurance. Arthur and Lillian weren't simply rebuilding a home. They were reminding everyone that giving is the surest way to belong. One afternoon, a young couple stopped by with a broken crib they couldn't afford to replace. Arthur spent the evening repairing it, sanding each edge until smooth. When he handed it back, the husband tried to pay him. Arthur only smiled and said, "Just promise to help someone else when you can." It became a phrase people in Maple Creek started repeating, a quiet motto, "Give to stay." By the first frost of winter, the shack no longer looked forgotten. Smoke rose steadily from its chimney flower boxes, bloomed with late-season herbs, and the sound of laughter often spilled from its porch. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was the heart of a small town learning to care again. And as the snow began to fall, Daisy sat proudly by the steps, tail sweeping through the cold air, watching the lights flicker across the valley. She wasn't just their dog anymore. She was Maple Creek's symbol of hope, the living proof that warmth could return to even the coldest places. Arthur and Lillian had come to Maple Creek looking for shelter. What they built instead was community. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that starts quiet birdsong coffee brewing Daisy, stretching by the door. Arthur was splitting firewood when he heard the sound of tires on gravel. It wasn't the slow roll of a neighbor's pickup or the friendly putter of the mail truck. This was heavier, sleeker, out of place. When he looked up, a black sedan was climbing the hill, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the gray sky. Two men stepped out, suits too crisp for Maple Creek shoes, too clean for the mud. They looked like the kind of people who never lifted anything heavier than a pen. Arthur wiped his hands on his jeans as they approached. The taller one led the way, carrying a leather folder under his arm. "Mr. Brooks," he asked, scanning the small home like he was inspecting inventory. "We represent Landcore Development. We need to discuss your occupancy." The word occupancy hit like a slap. Lillian stepped out onto the porch, her apron still damp from washing dishes. Daisy growled low, sensing tension. The man continued, his voice smooth and cold. "This property has been purchased by Landcore for redevelopment. According to our records, it was classified as abandoned and sold for unpaid taxes. You're currently trespassing. You have 30 days to vacate before demolition begins." Arthur stared at him, the words sinking in like water into stone. "Purchased from who?" "The county," the man replied, handing over a thick stack of papers. "The sale was finalized last month." Lillian took the documents, her hands trembling as she scanned the fine print. Legal jargon, signatures, seals, all the things that make wrongs look official. Arthur tried to stay calm, but his voice cracked. "We've been living here for months. We've rebuilt every inch of this place. There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," the shorter man interrupted, his tone impatient. "You're not authorized to occupy company property. If you refuse to leave, the sheriff will handle the eviction." The taller one smiled politely like a waiter delivering bad news. "You have 30 days. We recommend using that time wisely." They turned back to their car, their expensive shoes leaving shallow prints in the mud. The engine started with a purr, and within seconds the sedan disappeared down the hill, leaving only silence, the kind that weighs on your chest. Lillian stood on the porch steps, holding the papers like a death notice. Arthur didn't move. He couldn't. Everything they had built, every nail, every plank, every ounce of hope, felt suddenly fragile, temporary. Daisy nudged his leg, sensing something was deeply wrong. The shack, once alive with light and laughter, now seemed smaller, like it too was bracing for loss. That night, neither of them slept. The sound of the storm gutters clicking in the wind felt like a countdown. Arthur sat by the window, staring at the flicker of the porch light, thinking of the first time they had walked up this hill, scared, desperate, but determined. Back then, they had nothing left to lose. Now, they did. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about being erased again, about how people with money could make whole lives vanish with the stroke of a pen. Lillian quietly folded the eviction papers and placed them on the kitchen table. Her voice was soft but firm. "We're not leaving." Arthur met her eyes. For a moment neither spoke, but they both knew the fight had changed. It was no longer about rebuilding walls. It was about defending what those walls meant. They had survived betrayal, poverty, and storms. Now they were facing something colder, a system built to crush people who still believed in doing things by hand and by heart. And yet, as Daisy curled between them, Arthur whispered the words that had carried them this far. "We've fixed worse than this." Outside, the black car was gone, but its shadow lingered. And deep down, they knew this was just the beginning of a different kind of storm. The next morning, Maple Creek felt quieter than usual, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Arthur and Lillian sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice spread between them like a wound that refused to close. The ink looked colder in the daylight. They had read it so many times that the words had lost meaning except for the date, 30 days. Then came a knock at the door. It was Rose Mitchell, holding a worn leather satchel and wearing that same determined expression she'd once used to bring them soup. Only this time she wasn't carrying kindness. She was carrying something heavier, truth. She set the satchel on the table and opened it carefully. Inside was a bundle of yellowed papers, each protected by plastic sleeves. Thomas was meticulous about paperwork, she said, her voice steady. He registered this land legally years before he got sick. He never trusted the county to keep records straight. Arthur leaned forward, scanning the document. It was a property deed signed and notarized under Thomas Harper's name, the same Thomas who had once built this house with his own hands. The deed made one thing clear: the property had been privately owned, not abandoned, which meant the county had no right to sell it to Land Corps. Lillian pressed her fingers to her lips. So this house was never theirs to sell. Rose shook her head. Not even close. And that's not all. From the satchel she produced another paper, more fragile than the rest, a copy of Thomas Harper's will. He left this with my late husband, who was the town's lawyer. I kept it after Thomas passed, just in case something like this ever happened. The will was handwritten but clear, its language simple and direct. It stated that the property was to remain a home for anyone in genuine need, a place where love and labor could rebuild what life had broken. Lillian read the lines again and again, her eyes filling with tears. "He wanted this place to be exactly what we made it," she whispered. At that moment, Rose smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why you found it." Arthur exhaled slowly, feeling something he hadn't in weeks: hope. Not the fragile kind that breaks under pressure, but the kind that comes from knowing justice might still be possible. But hope alone wasn't enough. They needed someone who could turn these papers into protection. That's when Rose mentioned him, Frank Morrison. "He was my husband's old law partner," she explained. "Retired now, lives in Michigan. But Frank never forgot a case, and he's not afraid to take on bullies with money." By afternoon they had him on the phone. Frank's voice was gravelly, calm, and confident. He'd read hundreds of cases like theirs, developers preying on forgotten land, assuming no one would fight back. But this time, he said, they had something the others didn't: proof of ownership, community support, and a cause worth defending. "I'll take the case," he said without hesitation. "If they want a fight, they'll get one." After the call, Arthur stepped outside. The sky was streaked with late sunlight, the kind that turns everything gold before evening. He looked at the house, the patched roof, the new windows, the garden beginning to bloom again, and felt the weight lift off his shoulders. They weren't just living on borrowed land anymore. They were standing on a legacy. For months they'd rebuilt the Harper home without realizing they were continuing the dream of a man who believed no one should be left behind. And now that man, though long gone, was reaching across time to protect them. That night Lillian lit a candle on the table beside the old walking stick Thomas had carved. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure who she was speaking to. Thomas Rose, or something greater. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing through the trees, with a sound almost like applause. For the first time since the black car came, Arthur smiled. The storm wasn't over, but now they finally had shelter strong enough to withstand it. The courthouse in Millfield stood like a monument to time itself, tall, gray, and unbending. Its steps were worn smooth by years of people seeking justice, though few who climbed them ever felt sure they'd find it. On a cold Tuesday morning, Arthur and Lillian climbed those same steps hand in hand. Their clothes were simple but clean. Lillian had pressed Arthur's shirt the night before, though her hands trembled as she did it. Daisy waited in Rose's truck outside, watching through the window as if she knew her family was walking into battle. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. On one side sat the team from Land Corps, 3 lawyers in dark suits, all confidence and calculation. Their briefcases looked heavier than their consciences. Across the aisle sat Frank Morrison, 78 years old, with a suit that had seen better years, and eyes that hadn't lost a step. Frank adjusted his glasses, laid out his folders, and nodded toward Arthur and Lillian. "We're going to tell the truth," he said softly. "That's all we need to do." When the judge entered, everyone rose. Her name was Patricia Chen Sharp, fair, and known for her intolerance of corporate nonsense. She glanced at the papers before her, and then at the elderly couple seated beside Frank. "Let's begin," she said. Landcor went first. Their lead attorney spoke with practiced rhythm, her tone dripping with authority. She presented maps, sale documents, tax receipts, all the usual weapons of bureaucracy. "The defendants," she said, pointing toward Arthur and Lillian, "are unlawfully occupying property sold through legitimate means. This is a simple matter of ownership." Simple. The word burned. Lillian could feel her pulse in her throat. When it was Frank's turn, he stood slowly, his old bones creaking, but his voice strong. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not about paperwork. It's about people, and about a company that's built its profit on the silence of those who can't fight back." He opened a folder and began laying out photographs, one after another, across the judge's bench. Pictures of the house before and after Arthur's repairs. The garden Lillian had planted. The petition signed by nearly every resident of Maple Creek. Each image told a story words couldn't. "These two didn't trespass," Frank said, voice steady. "They restored what others threw away, and they did it on land that was never Landcor's to sell." The opposing attorney objected, but Frank barely looked up. He lifted a final document from his briefcase, the original property deed signed by Thomas Harper, along with his notarized will. "This," he said, "proves ownership." Mr. Harper left this property for those in need, people like Arthur and Lillian Brooks. The town made a clerical error, and Landcor took advantage of it. This isn't redevelopment, it's theft with better stationery. The room went still. Even the Landcor team shifted uneasily. Then came the twist evidence that changed everything. Frank opened another envelope, this one mailed anonymously a week before the trial. Inside were records from Landcor's past deals, tax sales targeting elderly homeowners identical to this one. Photos showed demolished houses, old couples standing beside bulldozed memories, a pattern too cruel to ignore. The judge's eyes hardened as she flipped through the pages. "Are you suggesting a systemic scheme of fraudulent acquisitions?" she asked. "I'm not suggesting," Frank replied. "I'm proving it." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Landcor's lawyers stammered objections, but the damage was done. After hours of testimony, the judge called for silence. She looked at Arthur and Lillian, two people who had fought not just for a house, but for dignity. "This court finds," she said finally, "that the defendants are the rightful owners of the property in question. Furthermore, the sale to Landcor is null and void, and this court recommends a full investigation into their acquisition practices." The gavel fell. For a moment no one moved. Then Lillian turned to Arthur, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We did it," she whispered. He nodded, his voice breaking, as he said, "No, we did it, all of us." Outside, Rose was waiting, her eyes wet before they even reached the steps. Daisy barked as they approached, tail thumping the truck door like a drumbeat of victory. Neighbors from Maple Creek had come too, cheering, hugging, bringing sandwiches and coffee, as if the courthouse steps were a festival ground. Arthur held the official deed in his hands, the paper warm from the sun. It had their names printed in bold letters: Arthur and Lillian Brooks, legal owners. Justice had found its way not through force, but through faith and truth. Later that night, As the sun set over the rebuilt home, Arthur placed the deed on the mantel beside Thomas Harper's walking stick and the candle Lillian had lit weeks earlier. 3 symbols, past, present, and hope standing together. They hadn't just won a case. They'd proven something bigger, that even when the system forgets you, you can still make it remember your worth. And somewhere in the quiet, Daisy let out a content sigh, curling up by the fire, as if she already knew home was truly theirs at last. Within a week of the court ruling, Maple Creek was no longer just a quiet town tucked between forgotten hills. It had become the center of something bigger, a story that refused to fade. The local newspaper ran the headline, "First Elderly Couple Wins Against Landcorp." By the next morning, regional stations had picked it up. A few days later, national outlets followed. Reporters came from as far as Chicago and Denver, knocking on Arthur and Lillian's door, eager to hear how 2 people in their 70s had taken on a corporate giant and won. Arthur didn't think of himself as a hero. He still woke early, fixed the porch rail, and fed Daisy before breakfast. But something had shifted. Strangers began sending letters, handwritten notes from retirees, single mothers, veterans, all saying the same thing. "You gave us hope." The story spread like a spark catching dry grass. Across the state, people who had once stayed silent began looking at their own property papers, their eviction notices, their final warnings. Some found courage to fight back. Others reached out to lawyers, local officials, even each other. Communities that had gone quiet under the weight of fear began to find their voice again. It was a domino effect no one had planned, but everyone felt. Landcorp, caught in the storm of public scrutiny, faced lawsuits from multiple counties. Investigations followed, revealing a chain of fraudulent acquisitions that targeted the elderly and vulnerable. The company's sleek black cars stopped showing up in small towns. For once, power bent toward fairness. Back in Maple Creek, Arthur and Lillian became symbols of something America had quietly forgotten: the strength of ordinary people who refused to give up. Local students visited them for school projects. Churches invited them to speak about resilience. Even the mayor came by one afternoon with a proclamation naming them honorary citizens of the town. But to them, the real victory wasn't in headlines or plaques. It was in the small things. The way Rose's garden bloomed again that spring, the sound of children laughing outside their rebuilt fence, the sight of Daisy napping on the porch while neighbors waved as they passed. Lillian often said, "We didn't win for ourselves. We won so others could stay home too." And that was true. Their fight had turned justice from something distant and abstract into something touchable, something as real as a roof that doesn't leak, a door that locks a place you can call your own. When winter came, Arthur carved a small sign and hung it above the porch. It read, "Hope lives here." People who visited often stopped to take pictures of it, smiling, like they'd found proof that good still wins sometimes. And on quiet nights, as the fire crackled inside and the wind brushed softly against the window panes, Arthur would look at Lillian and say, "Funny how we came here with nothing and ended up building something bigger than a home." Lillian would nod, smiling through the glow of the firelight. "We built faith," she'd reply. Because what started as a battle for survival had become a reminder for everyone that no one is ever too old, too small, or too forgotten to stand up and change the story. In the months after their victory, life in Maple Creek began to settle into a new rhythm. The story of Arthur and Lillian had already traveled far beyond town lines, but they weren't interested in fame. What mattered to them was what came next, what to do with the second chance they had been given. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun fade over the hills, Arthur said, This house has given us more than shelter. Maybe it's time we let it give something back." Lillian smiled, understanding instantly. That was how the idea for Maple Cottages was born. They envisioned small, affordable homes built for seniors who wanted to live independently, but safely cozy spaces with ramps instead of steps, wide doors for wheelchairs and gardens close enough to reach from a porch chair. Arthur started sketching designs at the kitchen table, his hands steady with purpose. Lillian reached out to Rose and a few townspeople to form a committee. Soon what began as a simple dream turned into a movement. The townsfolk rallied behind them. Retired carpenters offered to help. High school students eager to learn a trade joined as apprentices, working beside Arthur on weekends, measuring, sawing, and hammering under his patient guidance. He taught them not only how to build, but why building mattered, how every plank nailed straight could change a life. Meanwhile, Lillian handled what she did best, caring for people. She organized volunteers to cook meals for the workers and created a small network of nurses willing to check in on elderly residents once the cottages were complete. She called the initiative Rebuild Dignity because to her, a home was never just four walls. It was the right to feel safe, useful, and seen. Daisy, now older but still spry, became the project's mascot. She greeted visitors at the construction site, trotting between workers and wagging her tail like a foreman, keeping everyone in line. Children came by to play with her after school, and soon her image, nose proudly lifted, eyes full of light, was painted on the side of the first cottage. Word spread quickly. Donations trickled in from nearby towns, then from across the state. The first Maple Cottage was finished by spring, a modest one-bedroom with a small porch and a lilac bush out front. When they handed the keys to Mrs. Jensen, the widow who'd once been Lillian's patient, the woman cried. "I haven't felt this free in years," she said. By the end of the year, 5 more cottages stood in a neat little circle at the edge of Maple Creek, each one filled with someone who had once been overlooked. The sound of laughter, tools, and conversation filled the air. For the first time in a long while, the town wasn't shrinking. It was growing not through profit or progress, but through purpose. Arthur often said the houses were more than structures. They were proof that dignity could be rebuilt one nail at a time. Lillian said they were seeds, places where compassion could take root. And for everyone who came to visit, the message was simple. Getting old didn't mean being forgotten. On the anniversary of their court victory, the townspeople gathered at the Harper House, now the headquarters of Rebuild Dignity. They unveiled a wooden plaque carved by Arthur and signed by everyone who had helped build the cottages. It read, "From broken boards to rebuilt lives, Maple Creek remembers." As the crowd applauded, Daisy barked her tail, wagging like she knew the words were meant for her too. That night, Arthur and Lillian sat beneath the same porch light where their story began, watching the cottages glow softly across the field. The air carried the scent of cedar and fresh paint, but what lingered most was peace. They had started as 2 people fighting for a home. Now they had helped others find theirs. And in the heart of Maple Creek, the Harper House, once forgotten, had become more than a shelter. It had become a beacon. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope. There was no return address, only their names written in handwriting. Arthur recognized instantly, shaky, uneven, but unmistakably Brian's. For a long moment, Arthur just stared at it, his hands frozen mid-air. Lillian looked up from the stove. "Who's it from?" she asked. Though she already knew, he didn't answer right away. He set the envelope on the table between them as if it were something fragile capable of breaking the peace they had built. When he finally opened it, the first words hit like a slow tide. Dad. Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know that I finally understand. Brian had seen the news, the photos of them standing on the courthouse steps, the story of how they had rebuilt their lives and their home. He wrote about watching it unfold from his living room, feeling a kind of shame that didn't fade with time. He admitted that his decision to evict them had been born out of greed and pressure, not just from his wife, but from his own fear of looking weak, of being the son who couldn't provide. He wrote, "You gave me everything, and I repaid you with distance. I told myself it was business, but really it was cowardice." The letter was raw, unpolished, and full of stops and starts, the kind of writing that comes from someone trying to rebuild a bridge long after the river's changed course. Brian said he had left his old job, that his marriage had fallen apart, and that losing everything had made him realize what he'd thrown away. He ended simply, "If you ever want to see me again, I'll come. If not, I'll understand. I just needed to say I'm sorry before it's too late." When Arthur finished reading, the silence in the kitchen stretched long. Lillian stood at the sink, gripping the counter, her eyes glassy. For years they had tried not to say his name aloud. It was easier that way. But now here it was again, in ink, an apology, in the fragile handwriting of a son who had once turned his back. She turned toward Arthur and whispered, "He's reaching out." Arthur didn't speak for a while. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the letter, as though it were both a wound and a miracle. "He hurt us, Lil," he finally said. But maybe this is him trying to stop hurting himself. They spent the rest of the day thinking, not talking, just sitting by the window while Daisy lay at their feet. Forgiveness, they realized, isn't about forgetting. It's about deciding that the pain no longer gets to control the story. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Arthur picked up his pen. The table lamp cast a soft light over his paper. He didn't write much, just a few honest lines. "We don't know what comes next, Brian. But the door isn't closed. If you want to start again, come home. We'll have coffee ready." The next week a car pulled up by the gate. This time it wasn't a black sedan. It was a dusty old pickup with a nervous man standing beside it holding a single sunflower. Lillian met him halfway down the path. She didn't speak. She just wrapped her arms around him and let the silence do the forgiving. Arthur stood on the porch watching the two figures, the mother and the son, holding each other like they were trying to make up for lost years. When Brian finally looked up, his eyes met his father's. No words were needed. Arthur nodded once, and that was enough. That night they all sat around the same kitchen table where the letter had once rested unopened. Lillian made soup, the same recipe she used to make when Brian was a boy. Daisy lay curled up under the table tail, thumping softly. For the first time in years, the house felt whole again. Not perfect, not painless, but whole. Later, as Arthur watched his son laugh quietly with his mother, he realized something simple yet profound. Family isn't repaired with money, apologies, or even time. It's rebuilt with respect, one honest moment at a time. The past still lived between them, but it no longer ruled them. They had weathered every kind of storm, betrayal, loss, greed, and still somehow love had found its way back. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and new beginnings. The Harper house, once broken and reclaimed, now held another miracle inside its walls, not of wood and nails, but of forgiveness finally finding a home. The morning light crept gently across Maple Creek, washing the fields in gold. The air was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when a story has finally found its ending. Arthur sat on the porch with a blanket across his knees, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Beside him, Lillian rocked slowly in her chair, the sunrise painting her face in soft orange light. Daisy lay between them, her head resting on Arthur's boot tail, flicking lazily. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of everything they had endured, everything they had rebuilt, and everything that had found its way back to them. From where they sat, they could see the maple cottages glowing in the early light. Smoke curled gently from chimneys. Curtains shifted as the town's older residents began their morning's boiling tea, feeding birds, or simply standing by their windows, grateful for another day under a roof that meant safety. Arthur's gaze lingered on those rooftops. They were simple, sturdy, and built by many hands, young and old, rough and careful. Every nail, every plank carried a story. He thought about how strange it was that the same man who had once been cast out with nowhere to go now helped others find shelter. Life, he realized, had a way of coming full circle, not through miracles, but through persistence. Lillian turned to him, smiling softly. "You ever think about how far we've come?" Arthur chuckled under his breath. "From sleeping in a truck to running a community project?" "Yeah, I'd say that's a decent upgrade." They laughed quietly together, the sound mingling with the chirping of birds and the rustle of trees. The pain that once felt endless had softened into something gentler, a kind of peace that comes only when you've fought long enough to appreciate stillness. Down the hill, a few townspeople were gathering near the community center, setting up tables for the winter fair. Brian was among them, helping carry boxes of decorations. He waved when he spotted his parents on the porch. Arthur raised his coffee mug in return. It was still strange seeing his son there, not as the man who had hurt him, but as someone trying to belong, to make amends, to build again. Lillian squeezed Arthur's hand. "He came home," she said quietly. Arthur nodded. "And so did we." For a while they just watched the sunrise. It was the same sun that had watched them lose everything years ago, the same that had seen them rebuild piece by piece. But today, it didn't feel like a witness to pain. It felt like a promise. The Harper house stood proudly behind them, once a forgotten shack, now a landmark of hope. It wasn't perfect. The paint had faded in places, the steps creaked, and the front door still stuck on humid days. But every imperfection told a story of hands that had refused to give up. People often came by now, not to offer pity, but to seek wisdom. Students, builders, even young couples would visit to ask how they did it, how they kept going when everything fell apart. Arthur always said the same thing: home isn't given, it's built with love and courage, because that's what this place had become. Not just a home for two people, but a symbol for anyone who'd ever been forgotten, anyone told they were too old, too late, or too small to matter. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the porch. Lillian leaned her head on Arthur's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did it, didn't we?" He smiled, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, we really did." And as the day began, the house seemed to breathe with them, the boards creaking softly, the wind brushing through the lilacs, Daisy sighing in her sleep. It was more than wood and nails now. It was memory, endurance, love, and proof that even the most broken things can be rebuilt. In that golden light, everything felt whole again. The forgotten had been remembered, the abandoned had been honored, and the home they had once lost had become something greater, a place where dignity, compassion, and courage would live on long after the last sunrise. Because in the end, home isn't a gift. It's something you build with your hands, your heart, and your faith that it's never too late to begin again.